All right, let's talk about a flight that was supposed to be completely routine. It's November 27th, 1987. South African Airways Flight 295 is 9 hours in, flying from Taiwan to South Africa. Everything's normal. But then, less than an hour away from a quick stop in Mauritius, this massive Boeing 747, they called it the Helderberg, just vanishes over the Indian Ocean. And what follows is one of the most baffling and honestly controversial mysteries in the history of flight.
Okay, just look at this timeline. It is absolutely chilling. I mean, it shows you just how fast everything went wrong. 1 minute, it's a normal flight. The next, a desperate fight for their lives. From that first smoke alarm to the moment they think the plane hit the water. We're talking about a window of just 18 minutes. 18 minutes. That's it.
So to really get our heads around what happened in those last few minutes, we've got to talk about the plane itself. Because this wasn't just any 747. It had a really unique design. And that design, well, it's right at the heart of this whole tragedy.
This plane was called a Combi. And for South African Airways, these planes were a total lifeline. See, this was during apartheid, and a lot of African countries wouldn't let their planes fly over. So they had to take these super long routes. The Combi was a game changer because it could carry both passengers and a ton of profitable cargo on those long hauls. But, and this is the crucial part, putting a giant cargo hold on the same deck right behind the last row of seats, that turned out to be an absolutely fatal design flaw.
So you hear these words from Captain Nudies, so calm but so incredibly urgent. You can just imagine the scene in the cockpit as his crew starts this desperate fight. The alarm was for the main cargo deck, and by the time they could even really figure out what was happening, it was way too late. This wasn't just a little smoke, it was a full-blown inferno. It was already burning through the plane's wiring and just pumping the cabin full of toxic fumes.
So the plane is gone. What happens next? Well, the mission shifts from rescue to recovery. And the challenge ahead of them, it was something nobody had ever faced before. The scale of this thing was just unprecedented.
Yeah, 4,400 meters. Let that sink in for a second. To put that into perspective for you, that is deeper than where the Titanic rests. Way deeper. Trying to pull anything up from that depth, it had literally never been done before. They were in completely uncharted territory. And as the lead investigator, Rennie Van Zyl, said, the government could have just thrown up their hands. They could have said, hey, it's too deep, it's too expensive, we can't do it. And a lot of people probably would have understood. But Van Zyl, he was absolutely determined to find out what happened, because the stakes here were massive, not just for the families who lost loved ones, but for anyone, anywhere who stepped onto a 747. And the clock was absolutely ticking. They had a hard deadline. The black boxes, the flight recorders, they have these little locator beacons or pingers, and those pingers only have about 30 days of battery life. So it was this mad dash. They had to launch this massive search in the middle of the Indian Ocean, and get this, they were using technology that, in some cases, they were still building. The pressure was unbelievable. Okay, so while this incredible deep-sea search is getting put together, a completely separate investigation is happening back on land. And what they uncovered was, frankly, shocking. It was all about the plane's design and the so-called safety tests that were supposed to prove it was safe.
This is where things get really wild. Look at the difference here. On one hand, you have Boeing's official certification test. It was basically a small, controlled fire with a single bale of tobacco leaves. Very neat, very tidy, easy to put out. But then you have the reality of what happened on the Helderberg. We're talking about a raging inferno fueled by tons of cargo, plastics, and packaging. This thing was so intense it created its own weather system inside the plane, making all the built-in safety features completely useless.
And here is the most tragic irony of all. The crew did exactly what they were trained to do. They followed the emergency checklist to the letter. But in doing so, they might have actually sealed their own fate. You see, the checklist for clearing smoke was designed for a fire that was already out. But this fire was very much alive. So when they turned on the fans to clear the smoke, they probably just pulled toxic carbon monoxide into the cabin. And the next step, opening the doors to vent the smoke, would have been like pouring gasoline on the fire, feeding it a fresh blast of oxygen.
All right, let's go back to the ocean floor. Against all odds, the search team starts to recover pieces of the wreckage, and this brings investigators closer to figuring out where the fire started. But the biggest question, why it started, that was still a complete mystery. Recovering the cockpit voice recorder was a huge victory, a total technical marvel, but it was also a huge frustration. It showed that just 14 seconds after the first alarm, circuit breakers were already popping all over the place. The fire was moving so fast, so violently, that it just melted the recorder's wiring after only 81 seconds. 81 seconds. And then, silence. Those final, desperate moments of the flight, they're lost forever.
So what do? They start piecing together the wreckage they found, like a giant, tragic puzzle. And by doing this, they were able to pinpoint the fire's epicenter, the front right cargo pallet. So the official theory became that a small fire probably ignited gases coming off all the polystyrene packaging in the cargo, creating this massive flash fire. It makes sense, right? But it still left them with that one massive, unanswered question. What started the fire in the first place? What was the spark?
And with the official investigation hitting a total dead end, that's when the rumors started. Dark rumors, and they were all tied directly to the incredibly secretive political climate of South Africa under apartheid.
You see, there were a few key pieces of evidence that just didn't add up. First, the heat. Experts said a normal fire couldn't have gotten hot enough to melt the plane's skin like that. We're talking 300 degrees Celsius on the outside. Then they found this tiny iron particle that pointed to a self-oxidizing fire. That's a fire that basically brings its own oxygen, so it burns way hotter and way faster. And all this led to a pretty sinister theory, that because South Africa was under an arms embargo, the state airline was secretly being used to smuggle in military supplies, and that maybe, just maybe, some volatile rocket fuel was the real cause of the fire.
Fast forward about a decade. Apartheid is over, and South Africa's new Truth and Reconciliation Commission decides to take another look at the crash. Now, the original investigation, the Margot Commission, basically just said, we don't know what caused it. But the TRC came to a much more controversial conclusion. They said, and I'm paraphrasing here, that nothing on the official cargo manifest could have caused that fire. The implication was crystal clear. Something unofficial had to have been on that plane.
And at the end of the day, for the families of the 159 people who died, people like Valerie Lottering, who lost both of her parents on that flight, this lack of answers is just a wound that can't heal. It's not just the grief of losing their loved ones, it's the torment of feeling like the real story, the full truth, has been buried.
So you have to ask, will we ever know the full truth? Because the mystery of the Helderberg, it really is so much more than just a plane crash. It's a story about a crew's unimaginable bravery against impossible odds. It's a story about a flawed aircraft design that was approved based on questionable tests. And maybe it's a story of a political secret so dark that it was buried along with the wreckage 4,400 meters beneath the waves, forever.